Hey folks, welcome to another one of our author panels for our most recent book, Leading with Compassion, Cultivating Connection from the Inside Out. I'm here with two authors. I dare say they're two of my favorite authors, but I can't play favorites to everybody because there's 23 other authors for this book. But I have had the opportunity to read their chapters and get to know some of them pretty well over the last few months and year or so. So it's just really just my joy and my pleasure to invite you both here to talk about your chapters and the process of writing this collaborative book with Changing Work. We're going to start off with the awkward part of doing introductions. So, Sabrina, I'd like to start with you. And if you could go ahead and give yourself a little bit of an introduction just so folks know who you are and what you're all about.
Sure. Thanks so much, Nick. So, I'm Sabrina Riley. I am a transgender woman. I work in finance and am diving even deeper into so much of this writing and speaking and some consulting. And I would say I'm really just passionate about just sharing my experiences and helping other people to be their most authentic selves and to truly be living a life that they love.
Mm, love that. I need to update my own bio. That's great. Sharona, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're here?
Yeah, I'm Sharona. I use they, them pronouns, I identify as non binary, and I spent 11 years working in tech, first in the engineering side, and then shifted over to doing diversity, equity, inclusion work. And I'm really passionate about mindfulness and unpacking and unlearning my own privilege and the ways that that's benefited me in the world. And I'm really passionate about helping people on their own journeys of anti racism, anti oppression, doing their own unlearning and figuring out how to integrate that showing up for yourself and caring for your own stuff while also showing up for community and hopefully creating a better world where everyone is free and we can all live in harmony, ideally.
Ah, love it. Love it. Love it. Love it. Well, thank you both for all the work that you're doing in the world. Thanks for being here with me today. I realized at the top I didn't even introduce myself. My name is Nicholas Whitaker. I'm one of the co-founders of Changing Work. I use he, him pronouns. And I'm going to do as little talking as possible today. This is really mostly about the two of you and the amazing work that you've done writing chapters for this book. Again, the name of that book, Leading with Compassion, Cultivating Connection from the Inside Out. If you haven't had the chance to read it yet, I definitely recommend checking it out. You can find that on our website at changingwork.org under media. Sabrina, I'd like to start with you, and really just because it was in the order of the chapters that I read this morning. But you have a chapter called Transforming, and it doesn't translate if I just read it out loud, but the way you wrote it out, transforming the weight of my own expectations. I want to start there and talk a little bit about, first of all, that title. Tell me about that title. Where did you come up with that, and what does it really mean to you?
Um, Honestly, the title means everything. It was some, I like to say, co-creation with ChatGPT. It gave me some different ideas, and then I actually kind of started using that parentheses around things after trans for a lot of the other work that I'm doing, because of I love that it just signifies the experience that I'm bringing to the writing or to the conversation. But this is a chapter or a title, I should say, that's really reflective of almost my entire experience so far. I'm almost 30, a little over a month away as we're sitting here, and honestly, the weight of my own expectations of myself and others have dictated almost my whole life so far, and all kinds of other things that happened.
I love that. Yeah, and I had a feeling that might have been kind of important to you, the title and the way that you kind of frame that. For folks who haven't actually seen the chapter, the parentheses right around, is it the beginning, the trans, or the forming part? I can't.
It's around the forming. So in everything that I do, the trans is always just kind of by itself, and then parentheses is around the other portion of the word.
Yeah, and so just that even that framing, kind of putting those addendum words around in parentheses, like what does that evoke for you? And like what are you hoping to evoke in the audience when they see that?
I just like to be able to use it as a way to explain the different life experience that I've had. Because in truth, I don't believe that I absolutely need to identify the way that I do. Like theoretically, I don't think that my gender matters, but it does when I tell stories like this where I was effectively a straight white man my entire life, my first 28 years, and then all of a sudden now I'm somebody so entirely different, and the learning that I'm doing from that. So more than anything, I just love being able to use it as a way to kind of tell the story.
Mm, yeah, thank you for that. And I want to come back to your story. There's a lot of elements in what you shared that I think are going to be ripe for conversation. But Sharona, I also kind of wanted to turn the attention back to you for a second because you also, I love, first of all, your entire chapter, but the title and the way you kind of started with that. Maybe we could start a little bit there and like what brought you to that particular title and why does that hold importance for you?
Yeah, so my chapter is titled Slowing Down and Showing Up. And it was actually just what I wrote on the top of the page when I started writing the chapter, or maybe I had written a portion of it and then I wrote that. And I think when I did the initial draft, I like put in the comments like open to other chapter titles, and the editor was like, no, I think this is actually the perfect chapter title. Um, and so I think for me, one of the big things that I noticed in doing corporate diversity, equity, inclusion work was that there was very little slowing down.
Mm,
And in fact, Nick, you and I first met through this Mindful Workplace Alliance that we were both a part of, with as representatives from our companies. And I had some fights with the DEI leaders at Intel about mindfulness and its role in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And I basically received a lot of pushback that mindfulness was a wellness thing and did not have anything to do with diversity, equity, inclusion. And what I witnessed and what I talk about in my chapter is the way that people not having mindfulness practices made it challenging for them to slow down and show up for me, which, a lot of my chapter was around my challenge with coming out as non-binary and people getting my pronouns wrong over and over again. And so to me, that slowing down piece
mm,
is like a necessary first step to showing up. And I don't think I use this quote in my chapter, but I frequently reference Viktor Frankl, who says between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies the power to choose, and in that choice lies our growth and freedom. I'm not entirely accurately quoting that, but it's close. And so to me, it's that slowing down gives us that choice.
mm.
And so people can be very committed to showing up inclusively, but in the moment, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, Sabrina, people don't even catch themselves misgendering someone because they don't even have that capacity to pause in the moment and see it happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And that really spoke to me quite a bit. And we'll get into more of the details on your chapter in a little bit, but I wanted to open this up to both of you because I think there's so much interesting overlap between your two chapters. Journeys are obviously quite different. You've had different experiences, but what I hear in a lot of what you're sharing in both of your chapters is like the importance of presence and slowing down and mindfulness, and to me, Shona, like part of what you're sharing, I mean, first of all, the fact that you were on a global diversity and inclusion team and were struggling so much with being misgendered on that team, to me, that was just such a gut punch when I read that. It was just like, God, we have a lot of work to do. And I'm kind of curious, just like from your perspective, now that you're kind of past that team, you're off doing other things, you know, where do you think we're at in like the global state of this type of work? Call it DEI work, call it mindfulness. Like I see the overlap personally. Like, where do you see us right now in terms of like the evolution of all of this?
It really depends where I am on any given day. I see in a lot of my anti-racist, unlearning whiteness kind of world, I see a huge uptick in bringing in somatics or like body focused practices into that space, and that being like core and foundational, that we need to notice how all of this stuff is happening in our body and unlearn it in our bodies.
Mm.
um, and so I feel really uplifted by seeing the presence more and more of that work in the kind of activist world. And then in the corporate world, I mean, obviously, I don't need to point out to people that DEI initiatives are being dismantled everywhere right now. Um, and one thing I've been sitting with is the reality that the way that DEI was being done and is still being done a lot of places is not actually very human centered. I had a conversation with someone a while back about this idea of DEI being more about liability than about people. And so I've been sitting with that, and I try to maintain some optimism and hope that maybe on the other end of some of this dismantling, we come out with some better ways of doing things that are more human focused, while also acknowledging that this dismantling that has happened is actively harming a lot of people today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that reflection. And obviously the name of this book is Leading with Compassion. And so much of this process of leading with compassion, I think, is also tied to perhaps our first book, which is like based on self-awareness. And this idea, and I think your title of your chapter, Sharona, does such a great job of illustrating this. It's like, how do we slow down and be present and show up in the ways that we need to, and with the way other people need us to as well. And Sabrina, this is part of, I think, also what I was hearing in your chapter. You kind of paralleled it quite a bit with your relationship with your partner, with your wife previously, and how the ways that you were showing up, and perhaps maybe I'm stretching it a little bit, but the way you were showing up and being reactive and not being able to be present and slowing down was creating this tension that now later in life you're able to look back on and reflect on and be like, oh, I could have done this differently. I'm just kind of curious, like your thoughts on that reflection and how that maybe connects to what we're talking about right here.
Yeah, I honestly I'm kind of processing and integrating a little bit more for myself as Sharona's kind of talking through the connection between mindfulness and self-awareness. I think in reading their chapter, I get a little bit of that, but hearing us talk about it is even more impactful, and it's interesting because I talk about it in my chapter and in a lot of my writing. So much of who I was and the way that I interacted with the world involved a ton of self awareness, but not very much mindfulness for a long time. And specifically, what you're referring to, where I in many ways hurt my ex-wife, especially in terms of trying to push her to work harder and be more successful and to love herself more. I wasn't stopping to see any of that harm in what I was doing. I just had the self-awareness of um, what I'm capable of, or I've done all of this work on myself. So let me just go to helping her without really any sort of consideration for how I was doing that.
Yeah, yeah, I'm smiling here too because there's a bit of an irony there of like, what you're sharing, trying to help her understand how to love herself differently and to like express compassion for herself. And there's like this pushing kind of energy, and there's like this intensity to it that, and I think even Sharona mentioned this in her own chapter, or their own chapter, this idea of um intention and like the intent behind things, and versus like the actual like harm that's being done. And I think it's really, really important to kind of call this out. We don't always know the harm that we're doing, and our intentions might be really strong, it might be really good, but we're still not being skillful, we're not still like really showing up in the way that we need to. And there's this gap here. And I think, Sharona, what you're really offering is this idea of like, can we slow it down? Can we create that spaciousness so that we can have that opportunity for freedom and that opportunity for true connection with each other? And I just think it's like a really beautiful message that you left at the end of your chapter, which is like, we all have this opportunity to show up differently. We have this opportunity to show up more powerfully, not just for other people, but also for ourselves. So I'm just kind of curious, as even, just as I'm reflecting on that, like what kind of comes up for you?
Yeah, well, first I just want to point out just something that just happened on the call, which is I see you caught yourself misgendering me and immediately adjusted, and then it wasn't like a thing. We didn't need to make a big deal out of it. So I just wanted to appreciate you doing that as an example. I'm sure not intentionally, but to what, I hope to see when people are cultivating mindfulness practices in their life. Um, and now I'm forgetting exactly what your question was, but I think it
Yeah.
was around this
Intent.
like showing up differently piece. Was that?
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
talk about intention, like kind of that gap between intention and the harm that we might do. And we might have the most, optimistic and like
yeah.
altruistic intentions, but like if we're not really being present to what's happening, and I'm glad you actually even mentioned that because that was not by design. But I think what I'm always trying to do is trying to model like what I've heard from many different people that have different pronouns than me and have
Mhm.
different experiences moving through life, like how to do this in a way that doesn't make it a huge thing. And this, I
Yeah.
can quickly course correct, and I don't make it necessarily about you and needing to apologize. And you directly talk about this in your chapter. So, yeah, like
Yeah.
kind of rooting it around intent and harm.
Yeah. So, um, I'm really glad you brought up this point, and I actually had something happen a couple weeks ago with a dear friend of mine who is also my roommate, and they are an Indigenous person, and there was some harm that I did, and they were really hurt by it, and it took them a couple weeks to even be able to process how hurt they were, and I had to ask what was going on with them because I was not aware that I had hurt them.
Mhm.
And when they did communicate to me how hurt they were in this long text message, I spent 2 or 3 days just like a total mess,
Mm.
crying, like falling apart, like, and part of that messiness was that I didn't understand like the racial terms that they were using around the harm that I had done. And I started pulling on like all these different frameworks I've learned around repair and harm. And like one of the core things is like find other when it's a racial thing, like find other trusted white people that I can process this with
Mm.
to learn and understand what I did. And I did that. And that was also hard.
Mhm.
And then I was able to revisit things with them. But one of the other things, and I think I wrote about this in my chapter, that I've learned is, it might not be possible to make repair with the person. And what's really important is showing up differently the next time you're in some kind of similar situation. So I just wanted to share that I entered this conversation. I asked if they were open to repair. They're a very dear friend of mine and they know the work that I have done. So they fortunately were willing to have that repair conversation. But in that conversation, every step of the way, I was being aware and thinking about, active listening, giving them as much space as they needed, reflecting back what they shared, asking um, after I reflected it back in an open-ended way, what did I miss?
Mhm.
And then asking them if they were open to receiving an apology
Mm.
and not just offering that. And then after I offered the apology, asking if they were open to hearing my perspective about what had happened. And all of this has to be an invitation. Um, and I still like am aware that, even though we had this lengthy conversation, there's still a rupture that happened there. And and I've been sitting a lot with this idea from someone else who I is a teacher of mine of like how can the things that we've learned serve the whole world? And so I've been sitting with how I actually want to write about this thing that happened so that it can be a lesson because one of the things I've seen, especially in like the white activist world, is a lot of people being called out in maybe not the kindest of ways for racial harm and not understanding like why the thing that happened is racial harm. And one of my learnings from this process is that the dynamic may not be explicitly racial, but race is inherently part of everything that happens in this world we live in where whiteness is lifted up over all other races.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a powerful, powerful reflection. And I think this actually ties to something that Sabrina was writing about that I'd like to kind of call forward. Um, and not to center myself in the conversation, but I think that this is actually really potentially a powerful lesson. For a lot of folks, I hear these conversations quite a bit, either around topics of race or identity or pronouns, and like, Sabrina and I have even had this conversation, of like the stumbling, and like what often occurs for folks. And I'm going to read this quote that Sabrina had in her piece here in just a little bit because I think is really relevant. It's this inner critic and this like this need or this desire to be perfect. And I have long since let go of that. I flub things all of the time. And I think that what I'm always trying to do as someone who desires to be supportive and an ally in these spaces is to like very quickly correct and not in that moment try to over index on apologies or over making it more of a thing than it actually is. And I see this also in my queer friend community. There's a lot of folks who they stumble and they'll screw up each other's pronouns and like they course correct and they correct each other, and it just kind of becomes part of the conversation. And to me, I just wanted to offer that as something for people to reflect on, who might be listening to this video, is like perfection isn't going to get you there. I think it's actually the compassion component that's actually really the most relevant piece. And Sabrina, I'd love to just like evoke you a little bit in this. First of all, you were talking about the inner critic, which for you was quite loud, for a lot of your life, and like really kind of tied to these childhood experiences that you were sharing. And you had this really beautiful line in here that I think was really relevant. It said you didn't change this overnight. It was a process, and it is a process that you're constantly evolving through. And there's this quote that I'd like to call out here. You say, "At first, compassion felt almost impossible to practice. I spent so long punishing myself for not living up to the rigid standards I had internalized from society and from my upbringing. Turning to compassion felt like admitting weakness, like I was letting myself off the hook for not being perfect. But embracing compassion wasn't really a choice. It became inevitable because nothing else worked. The constant pressure to perform, to measure up, and to strive for external validation kept burning me out." And I'm kind of curious, Sabrina, like as we're kind of talking about this environment that we're in, this world that we're in, where we're navigating difference, we're trying to find the right words, we're trying to find the right ways to show up for each other and for ourselves. As I read that passage back to you, what comes up for you, and kind of maybe where are you at in this journey and this process now of self compassion?
Yeah, honestly, when I was writing this chapter, I was kind of going through the first stages of that compassion to an extent, which was quite interesting because it was like the first time I was truly having some of these realizations. Not necessarily the first time I made any sort of attempt, but like the first time it truly felt possible. And one of the things that I think has really made a difference is I have constantly asked myself since coming out as transgender, so almost 2 years now, I've constantly asked myself honest questions. And the honest question I love the most is this actually what feels right? Is this actually who I want to be? Is this actually how I want to act? Like is this actually how I want to whatever it is, just is this how I actually want to, is the important part of that. And that's actually what got me out of this inner critic mindset and so many other things. Because when I was honest with myself, sure, there were moments where being really critical of myself worked or seemed like it did. There's success I can point to, like the story I tell about the bowling that I used to do, about the sport that I used to play. But I didn't enjoy that success whatsoever. I like to call that grim satisfaction. So it's like, yeah, it's there, but is it there in a meaningful way? And it wasn't. And so I think it's about having that honest conversation with myself and saying, like, is this actually working? Is this actually how I want to be? Is this actually how I want to do this? And often I find the answer is no. And if I ask why, which I don't think I always need to, but if I do ask why, it's often, well, because the world said, that was the way of success, or the world said that being critical of yourself was good, or, you should push your partner really hard. Like, but none of these things came from in here. None of these things came from anything that I actually cared about or I actually wanted.
Mm. Yeah, and there's something really powerful, I think, in what you're sharing here that actually kind of honestly ties back to what Sharona was saying, and Sharona, I might just kind of hearken some of what you were writing here as well. And they said, oh, now I lost where I was actually at in my place. So you said, and you had these really beautiful lessons at the end of your chapter, which actually to me is almost a playbook for folks that are navigating these waters and trying to find ways to really be supportive of other people and of themselves. And you started with I think one of the most important things. You said it's important to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And to me, that is so much about this process of learning how to be compassionate, both with ourselves and with other people. It's not comfortable, right? It's awkward. There's going to be stumbles along the way. You go on to say, do the inner work to be aware of what you don't know and what differences are hard for you to understand. And I think that's one of the beautiful things. And part of why I was so excited to have this conversation with both of you today. It's like these are not easy topics for everybody to navigate. And, even folks that are going through that on an individual personal level, it must bring up all kinds of discomfort and it must bring up all kinds of judgment that you need to navigate. And Sharona, you do this really beautiful job, I think, of calling people forward with some of these like steps at the end of your chapter and almost giving people kind of a roadmap to follow. And I'm kind of curious, like, how did you come up with these? Like, were they in order specifically for a reason? And is this like an ongoing evolution for you, like in terms of like the playbook of how to navigate these things?
That's a good question. I definitely didn't have like I wrote the chapter actually all in one go, like very fluidly. And then I got feedback from a lot of people. Actually, the editor was like, "Why'd you send it to so many people? That sounds concerning." But I what I was doing in the corporate space before I left was I was leading a global inclusive leadership program. So I was working with leaders all over the world, and certainly some of those concepts came from that work I was doing. And I'm not even remembering in this moment what exactly the concepts or the order is that I gave them in, but certainly the one you just reflected back to me was hitting me even in a different way in this moment about knowing what you don't know, and what you might not even ever understand. And one thing I just wanted to share that was coming up for me when you reflected that back is that I have actually myself been digging more into understanding the trans experience recently based on some feedback that I've received from some of my trans friends. And so I just want to highlight that, even though I am gender nonconforming and I'm in the LGBTQIA plus community, like there's still a lot for me to learn about other people's experiences. So it's just kind of a lifelong process. And I suspect that these things I wrote down will also be continuously evolving. And I think when I was writing them, I was viewing them as starting points.
Mhm.
And actually, the reason that they're listed out in that kind of clear way is based on some feedback I received from friends of mine who read the chapter and were like, this is a little murky, like, spell it out more clearly. So I really was only a little bit nervous, mostly excited to actually send my first draft of my chapter to like 25 trusted peers to gather their feedback because I wanted it to be impactful to the reader. And so, in some ways, that was like embodying my own work on my discomfort to put it out there and incorporate all of that feedback. And incorporating the feedback was such a satisfying process for me.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for that. Yeah, and there's one last bullet here that I wanted to reference as well. And Sabrina, I'd love to get your feedback on this as well. Sharona, you say, invite yourself into curiosity, seek to understand, but know you don't quite understand and might never understand. And to me, that just stood out as such a powerful call to action and just an evocation of compassion, in its most pure form. It's like there's things I'm not going to understand. There's experiences that both of you have that I won't be able to process fully, but I seek to understand. And the curiosity and compassion that I bring to it is, I think, the most important component. And, Sharon, I see you nodding your head. And Sabrina, I'm kind of curious, like your thoughts on this and maybe just what came up from you about what Sharona was just sharing.
What comes up for me as Sharona's sharing that, and also as you're asking that question, Nick, is also kind of just that personal lack of understanding. For sure, there's many other people's experiences I don't entirely understand, like Sharona's example of not understanding the trans experience is it totally makes sense to me because I have a newer close friend that's non-binary and asexual and aromantic, and like I'm just constantly learning so much about the experiences that they're having. But what really comes up for me is like being okay with not even completely understanding yourself or not understanding your own experience. I think it probably comes through in my chapter, even though I don't think I ever explicitly say it. But I used to want to know exactly how my life was going to go. I wanted to know every single detail. I wanted to plan everything out. I wanted to be able to clearly define myself. I lived in such rigidity that now doesn't even make sense to me. Like I can't even imagine being that person anymore. And honestly, giving that up was so much more beautiful. Like my life is so much more fun and joyful and interesting by just being okay with not knowing and not completely understanding myself and others, because I think that's just part of the fun and that's part of like the beauty and the mystery, and like we don't actually need to figure all of these things out.
Mm. Yeah, the permission that that gives to me is really profound. Um, there's so much that we can talk about here, and I just want to be a little conscious of time because I think the other piece of this whole process, and again, Sharon, I'm going to kick it back over to you here, and like another thing that you had in your chapter, you said doing this hard and often messy work to unlearn and shift how we're showing up expands the breadth and diversity of close, meaningful relationships that we are capable of cultivating and maintaining. I read that passage like 4 or 5 times because to me, it's like that is one of the biggest takeaways of this. It is messy. It's often not comfortable. Sabrina, you just mentioned something as well that I think is really relevant too. It's like, regardless of how we identify, whether it's transgender or non-binary or cis, gendered or whatever it might be, chances are we probably don't know ourselves as well as we think we do. And it is a journey of discovery and a process of uncovering those things so that we can best relate to each other. So when I read that, Sharona, the hard and often messy work, it's not even just in how we relate to other people, it's how we're relating to ourselves as well. And I guess the question that I have that really comes up for me is as you were both writing these chapters, and as you were going through this process of writing these chapters in community with other people, what was the messiness and that kind of hardness of that experience like for you? Like, Sharona, you mentioned that you kind of cast this around to like 25 other people because you really wanted feedback. And I'm kind of curious from either one of you, like, what was the experience of actually being a part of this journey and of exploring these concepts for yourself in your chapters?
Yeah, well, I have been writing off and on for years, and I've often, written blogs about my experiences and been told that, my writing's really powerful and meaningful. But um, I think this was the first time that I was actually like getting feedback on something before I published it.
Mhm.
Published it, click the button on the internet, because it was actually going to be officially published. And so it was really meaningful uh, to gather all that impact from all these people in my community. And actually, that line you highlighted about it expanding the breadth and diversity of relationships you can have actually came from one of my friends, because he was like, I think it's really important that you include this piece in there.
Mhm.
And it was almost, I think I changed around the words a little bit, but it was almost his words directly that I incorporated in the piece. So in some ways, I wrote it, but it was collaborative, as I feel like, this work has to be. It has to be collaborative. And and then I appreciated like just sharing my chapter with the other people writing the book, getting feedback about things that they were learning from it. Since I removed myself from the corporate world, I've definitely been living in a little bit of a bubble of people who are very similarly oriented around this like anti-oppressive work. And sometimes I forget in that bubble that I have things to offer. And ultimately, actually, writing this chapter of the book has redirected what I'm doing with my business. So I didn't really officially mention in my introduction that I'm a coach, but had initially launched my business to focus on supporting queer people in tech, because that's who I was and that's where I came from. So I'm like, that's what I know. And then through writing this book chapter and some deep reckoning with myself, I realized that I actually want to be supporting people on their allyship journeys, or what I call people who are aspiring allies, because I think I wrote this in the chapter, you're not an ally unless someone calls you an ally. Um, and through that, part of that reckoning was realizing that I was actually afraid of doing that work because I was afraid of messing up, even though I talk about how messing up is like a part of it. So I had to reckon with that in myself. And I had a couple of moments that happened, including like a random encounter with a older white man in a hot tub who was ranting about his frustrations with DEI work, that I was like, okay, the universe is just telling me this is the work that I'm supposed to be doing. So I'm really appreciative for the writing process to help guide me on my path.
Thank you for the work you're doing. It's amazing. Sabrina, I'd love to kick it back to you. Just any reflections you have on your journey of writing this chapter and just kind of the experience of being a part of this collaborative project.
Yeah, as you already know, Nick, this chapter completely changed my life. I wasn't in any fashion a writer, prior to what was it, maybe like 6 months ago. This kick-started everything. It also kick-started a lot of healing, as I already mentioned. A lot of things that I was kind of working through at the time really came through in this chapter. It wasn't like this thing I had learned, for 10 years and I was like giving everyone the advice on it. I was almost just kind of like telling some of this for the first time and like really healing some of it in a big way for the first time. But the writing itself, I just absolutely fell in love with it. It's kind of like the healing that came out of it for me in the coolest way. And I think this comes through, especially when I talk about my experiences with my ex-wife. I was someone who felt like because I had a lot of self-awareness and I had a lot of wisdom from a young age that I had a lot to give. And I chose to do that in a way that was very kind of pushy and forceful and hey, here are the prescribed things that you need to do. Here are the things that worked for me. So this is going to work for you. And not the least of which is harmful because at that point I was having the privileged experiences of being a white man, and having all the learnings through that lens. But what I realized is I don't need to do any of that at all. All I need to do, and all I actually want to do now through all of the other writing that I'm working on and the speaking and the courses and everything, is I just want to share my experience. And it's up to you how you show up to that space, what you get from that experience. And it was just a really beautiful way for me to realize that I'm not better than anyone else. I don't know better than anyone else. I don't need to fix anyone else. I can just share myself, and that's going to hit you however it needs to hit you, and that's perfectly okay.
Mm, no, thank you for that. Yeah, and again, thank you for just being a part of the process, both of you, along the way. It's just been such a beautiful thing to watch this evolve over time. I want to end with one last quote from Sabrina, and then I want to open it up to both of you for last thoughts, and then also to let people know where to find you and find your information if you're interested. Sabrina, you said, I'm learning that there is power in just noticing these moments and allowing myself to get back on track. I'm learning that growth doesn't have to be perfect, that progress isn't linear, and that I'm worthy of love and compassion at every stage of the journey, not just when I'm at my best, but when I'm struggling too. And I see both of you nodding your heads. That was a very powerful piece for me as well. Sabrina, I don't know, maybe there's a little last couple words that you have on that and kind of what that brings up for you as I read that back to you.
I actually don't know that I want to say anything to that I really want to add to that. I think the words do those concepts, I guess, if that's how we want to refer to it, justice. And I don't think there's any way I could reflect on that would make it more perfect than it already is.
Yeah, that's powerful. Yeah, fair enough. Well, while you got the mic, Sabrina, where do people find you if they want to learn more about you, if they want to read more of your writing, which is amazing? How do they find that?
You can finally find me primarily on both LinkedIn and Substack. That's where I'm really growing the writing, and we'll be talking about courses that I'm working on authentic sales and authentic leadership and all kinds of different things. Easiest I would say is for LinkedIn, and I'm guessing you'll put some different links in there, Nick. But simply put, if you go to linkedin.com, you can put slash in, so slash in, and then slash this version of you, and that finds me, and then the links to all of the other things, and the knowing what's going on with me and my work.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Sabrina. And Sharona, how about you?
Similarly, you can find me on LinkedIn, same prefix, but just slash Sharona. My name is spelled Chirona, and my website is mysharonarose.com. And I'm also on Instagram at mysharonarose. If you were to I actually just made my first Substack post this week. So I'm planning to use that space to share experiences that I'm having and unpack my lens of those experiences through privilege and my anti-oppressive learning journey. And my website currently is really pointing to the queer people in tech, but it's in the process of being overhauled. So in a couple weeks, if you go there, it will look very different. And yeah, I'm excited. There's also a form that you can fill out for ways you might be interested in being supported on your allyship journey so that I can help shape my offerings to meet the needs of people who want them.
I love it. I love it. Well, both of you, thank you so much for the work that you're doing in the world. Thank you for your support along my own allyship journey. I definitely will be checking out your website once you get that refresh, Sharona, and I've already subscribed to you on Substack, so I already got you there. For folks, if you haven't had a chance, one last shameless plug, if you haven't had a chance to get the book, it's available on Amazon and bookshop.org, Leading with Compassion, Cultivating Connection from the Inside Out. Just two of our amazing authors. There's 24 other ones or 23 other ones in there as well. Thank you both for the work that you're doing in the world and for being here and being along the ride with us on this journey of changing work from the inside out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks, Sabrina.
Thanks so much, Nick, Sharona. This was so beautiful.